Campaign 2020 is sponsored by Wisconsin Hospital Association, Quick Trip, Wisconsin Counties Association, Wisconsin Realtors Association, and Wisconsin Operating Engineers Local 139.
Paul Piotrowski of Stevens Point is a Democratic candidate in the 24th Senate District. The election is November 3. Paul, welcome to WisconsinEye.
Thank you for the invitation.
Well, let's start with the governor's 9-bill package of police reforms. You're a retired Stevens Point police officer. I think I read on one of your Facebook posts that dealing in reference to the Kenosha shooting, you saw, quote, no justification for deadly force. Do you support the governor's 9-bill package on policing reform, sir?
I believe that there's always better opportunities for more training for police officers. Chokeholds was something I was never trained in doing, so there are several of those proposals that I'd like to see, at least several of them enacted into law, and discussion on a number of the rest of them. The Wisconsin Professional Police Association also endorsed some of those proposals and talked about the need for a conversation about police reforms and the proper role of police in our society.
Well, one of them is a ban on chokeholds. Given your experience, how often are chokeholds, do you think, used in Wisconsin, sir?
I was never trained in chokeholds. They were banned by our department before I started in 1990. So that was something that was forbidden to me as a police officer 30 years ago. A lot of departments in Wisconsin had done the same. It is not something that's necessary, especially now there are other tools that police officers have for if you need to take a subject down, as far as pepper spray or taser or other things, and chokehold is something that's considered a deadly force option. If you're going to putting your hands on somebody's neck to choke them out of consciousness, that's a deadly force option. There are other things that you can do instead of that.
Just one further question. The governor's package would set up minimum training standards statewide for those that want to be police officers. Do we need universal standards, sir?
Yes, we do. And the Wisconsin Law Enforcement Standards Board does have an initial certification as far as every officer has to go through certain amounts of training when they first get hired. And then there's a requirement of 24 hours of training every year subsequent to that. Some of those are mandatory. Others are just left up to the department's discretion. There are other things that could be added as far as updating every year or 2 years to the police officer training curriculum.
Okay, let's move on to other subject. The state Senate Republicans would like to come back to the Capitol and overturn the governor's mask mandate. What's your position on that mask mandate, sir?
I believe that we need to follow the science, with doctors and epidemiologists telling us that wearing a mask and social distancing are things that will work to help prevent the spread of the virus. The virus doesn't care if we're Democrat or Republican or believe in masks or don't believe in masks. It's just looking for another host to infect. And this is a good way of preventing the spread of the virus. So I would encourage everyone, when you're out in public, out of your house, to wear a mask.
We just got a report that state tax collections held up through the year that ended June 30. Everybody's worried about tax collections in the current year. If we're $1.5 billion short, would you advocate raising taxes or cutting spending?
I believe that we have to take a look at what are our priorities that need to be funded for long term, and then find a way to fund those, and whether that's cutting some things or raising additional revenues in other manners. What are the long-term priorities that we need to fund, and how are we going to fund those? That needs to be done. The best option for that is for the HEROES Act that the U.S. House of Representatives has already passed, to backstop funding for state and local governments to be passed. luckily, the Legislative Fiscal Bureau announced on Monday that state revenue collections have held up, and we currently don't have a shortfall that would require a budget repair bill. But yeah, we're in the middle of the pandemic yet. We do not know what the full effects of that are going to be, and we're not sure how deep we are into the pandemic. Are we halfway through, a third of the way through? We just don't know, and we'll find that out as we go along.
Well, one question on taxes. Last year, the governor said he was willing to raise the gas tax to stabilize our highway funding. It's 30.9 cents, hasn't been raised in maybe 10 or 12 years. Could you support a gas tax increase, Paul?
As long as it's targeted for infrastructure, especially, yes. I've spoken to a number of people throughout the district, and especially farmers in the area are concerned about the conditions of the roads when they're transporting things from one field to another, and especially chemicals and fertilizers. They're worried that the roads are in such poor shapes in some areas that that's going to cause a spill. So we need to address our infrastructure needs and repairing our roads, and kicking the can down the road and borrowing money instead of raising a permanent solution to how we can better take care of our roads and bridges, something we need to do. And if that requires us to raise the gas tax, which we haven't done in more than a decade, we need to address that.
New subject. What's your position on legal and recreational marijuana?
My position on that, especially with medicinal marijuana, we should be passing that. There are obvious uses, medical uses for marijuana. Once we get that enacted, we need to take a look at the enabling legislation in our surrounding states that have already approved recreational marijuana and see what's going to work for Wisconsin. We need to come up with a way that it's going to work. The trend is marijuana is going to be legalized within the next 10 years. How are we best going to address that and create another revenue stream for state government, but also how do we do this safely, what amounts, and how are we going to regulate dispensaries for that substance?
The governor wants the next set of congressional and legislative district lines to be drawn by a People's Maps Commission that would forward it to the legislature. The Constitution says that the party in power should draw those lines. Who's right?
The party in power, and then we're talking about divided government here. Looking back at the way things have been handled in Wisconsin, 3 of the last 5 times districts have been drawn, they've been drawn by federal district courts because the legislature and the governor's hands were in different parties, couldn't decide. We've done it without the legislature drawing the districts. We've done it with federal courts already drawing districts. My preference would be go to the Iowa model. We input all the input from the census into a computer. The computer chooses the maps so that voters have the opportunity to choose their representatives instead of representatives and senators choosing their voters by drawing maps down to the block level.
Couple questions on property taxes. We're a high property tax state. Schools, local governments have been dealing with caps and limits on their property tax levies for more than 20 years. If you're a member of the Senate voting on the next state budget, should we continue those caps and limits on property tax levies?
This is a measure that restricts local control. Local governments, municipalities, school boards are closer to their voters. They should have the option of determining what best fits their needs and then have their voters determine whether they believe that's correct. And they can vote out members that they disagree with. They vote for, we've been doing budgeting for school districts via referendum for the last 6 to 8 years because they can't violate those revenue caps. And it's strangling, especially property tax poor districts. And it's in rural and urban districts alike have been feeling the stress of having to go to referendum every couple of years for operating expenses or even just maintenance expenses. I know Stevens Point just passed a school referendum 2 years ago to take care of $76 million worth of deferred maintenance on the school buildings. That's not new buildings, that's just taking care of what we have. But with the limits, they haven't been able to do that maintenance as it's been required. So it's been postponed until they were able to pass a school referendum. That's not a way to operate any type of your house, your business, and we shouldn't have our school districts doing that either.
Should local governments have new revenue-raising options? City of Milwaukee wants to levy a half-cent sales tax. There's a plan in the Capitol to broaden our 5% sales tax to now exempt products and services, give some of that money to local governments. Do local governments need new revenue options?
Yes, they do. I know that some of the local governments have been adopting a wheel tax as well to help facilitate road repairs. I know in Stevens Point, until recently, we were on a 210-year replacement cycle for our roads. No road's going to last 210 years. So there's got to be a way that we can provide for the necessary projects that we need done. Nobody wants to live on a road that feels like a washboard, grandma's old scrub board for doing laundry. And unfortunately, that's the state of many of our roads. So I believe that local governments, whether it's townships, counties, or cities, need to have the ability to fund those projects that they need to get done.
Hospitals, both in Wisconsin and nationally, of course, are on the front line of treating COVID-19 patients. If you're in the Senate voting on the next state budget, do hospitals need a greater priority than they may have in the current budget?
I think one of the things that we can do to help out hospitals, especially in rural areas, is accept Medicaid expansion. Not only would it provide 80,000 Wisconsinites with health insurance, but it would allow the state to raise Medicaid reimbursement rates, which we have not done in a while. Wisconsin's Medicaid reimbursement rates are amongst the lowest in the nation, and our healthcare costs are among the highest. We have seven of the 10 highest healthcare markets in the country, which is part of the reason we've lost a number of rural medical providers over the last 5 to 6 years, is they just haven't been able to make it because they're losing money on the low Medicaid reimbursement rates. So we need to provide a way for our hospitals, especially in our rural areas, to maintain profitability so they can stay in business. So you don't have to travel an hour or an hour and a half to get to a local medical facility in an emergency.
Yesterday, State Senator Chris Capping introduced a bill that said if a business or an organization has complied with CDC guidelines on COVID to protect customers and employees, they should be exempt from COVID lawsuits. Do we need that state law?
I don't believe we need that state law. We do need to make sure that everybody's following those CDC guidelines. I believe that there's a federal law that's being talked about. If that's passed, I see no need to institute a state law to follow the same thing.
Local governments, school boards and local governments, when they want to approve a public works project, should they have to give a preference to Wisconsin businesses? A study found in 2015, out-of-state contractors for public works projects got $72 million in contracts, but in 2018, that had more than doubled to $146 million. Should local governments have to give a preference to Wisconsin businesses?
I believe so. We should be keeping our public tax dollars locally and not giving it to out-of-state corporations and organizations. That helps provide Wisconsin families with good paying jobs so that they can support their families. So there should be a preference for Wisconsin companies so that Wisconsin workers can benefit from those public works dollars.
I've asked you about a lot of issues. Any other issues central to your campaign you want to bring up now, sir?
There's two. One is water quality. Water quality in the Central Sands region has been a problem for many years. In this area, it's nitrate contamination. In other areas of the state, it's forever chemicals known as PFAS or lead sewer pipes that need to be, or water pipes that need to be replaced. I have a sister who for several years lived on a farm east of Stevens Point and had to take water jugs to work with her to provide safe, clean drinking water because of nitrate contamination. There are currently 10 bills that have passed the Assembly that are waiting for action by the State Senate. The State Senate has not held any sessions since the early part of March. Not sure whether those bills are going to get a hearing or a vote yet this year. Those as first steps, need to be addressed. And then secondly, as somebody who's worked elections as both a poll worker, chief election inspector, and served as a city clerk for Stevens Point, we need to ensure that everybody who is eligible to vote can register, vote, and have their vote counted on election days.
Final question, differences between you and the incumbent you're trying to unseat on November 3, sir?
Pat Teston was the deciding vote on limiting the governor's powers and the lame duck legislation, along with Attorney General Josh Kaul's powers after their election and before they took office. He is the chair of the Health and Human Services Committee, has held 0 hearings on COVID-19. One would think that the state legislature would have an interest in informing the general public about COVID-19's impacts on Wisconsin, but they've held 0 hearings on that. And then he was also able to block consideration of the governor's proposal to expand Medicaid in the last budget. And we should do that. Expanding Medicaid would allow working families who earn too much to currently qualify for Badger Care, but they don't earn enough to afford health care on their own through the exchanges to purchase insurance at a reasonable cost.
Thank you. Paul Piotrowski of Stevens Point is a Democratic candidate in the 24th Senate District. The election is November 3. Paul, thank you for talking to WisconsinEye.
Thank you for the opportunity to talk to voters.
Thank you, sir. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Campaign 2020 is sponsored by Wisconsin Hospital Association, Quick Trip, Wisconsin Counties Association, Wisconsin Realtors Association, and Wisconsin Operating Engineers Local 139.